All right. Well, if you are of a certain age, you already know what that is. It's the theme music to the Alfred Hitchcock television show. I am living proof that in the 60s, if you were a child, if you were a boy in the 60s or a girl in the 60s, you would know who Alfred Hitchcock was without actually having ever seen anything he directed. Because he was sort of like that, you know. And the thing began with this music and a picture of him in silhouette, and then he's talking to the camera, and I knew exactly who Alfred Hitchcock was, except I didn't know anything about Alfred Hitchcock. He was an unusual director, I think, in that way and in lots of other ways. So we're going to have a conversation in particular about his relationship to actors and acting today. Before we do that, I have to tell you one thing, just in case it affects the show. I mean, I'm assuming it won't, but so let's see, 4 or 5 hours ago, I had the second Pfizer dose of the COVID vaccine, which, first of all, and Pfizer has not made a big deal of this, but some of us briefly after the second dose acquire the power of flight for about 48 hours. I actually flew up into a pine tree in my yard right before the show, but I might have other side effects as well. So if I collapse during the show, one of the guests will take over and host or something. I'm drinking lots of water because it's the only thing I know to do. And I think it's possible, actually, that when the book of Genesis is finally translated accurately, it's going to turn out that God said to Adam and Eve, look, just hydrate, okay? Just everybody just drink a lot of water and you'll be fine. And then they didn't do it. And, you know, there's no apple or snake or anything like that. All right, time to talk about Alfred Hitchcock. Enough about me and my ability to fly. Joining us today is Dan Callahan, who writes about film. His newest book is The Camera Lies, Acting for Hitchcock. Also joining us, as he has many times before, Tom Breen, managing editor of the New Haven Independent, and he hosted Deep Focus on WNHH Radio. It's in his contract, writer. I have to say it that way. He insists on it. So, first of all, and we should also say that we tried to get a woman guest who would be appropriate for this. Jonathan McPants, the producer, tried very hard. I think it's, would have been good in this situation simply because there are so many issues about Hitchcock and women, but you'll just have to trust us or resent us or do whatever. So first of all, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Dan. So, maybe just to begin with an overview, Dan, you say in the book that Hitchcock's creativity is based on fear and wanting us to be afraid with him. As I think about Hitchcock, to me, I don't think there's another director I can think of who is so obsessed, or auteur, who is so obsessed with the issue of trust. So many of these movies are about, can I trust this other person? Is this person telling me the truth about him or herself? Was I wrong to distrust this person? Maybe I should have been distrusting that other person there, whereas this person who didn't seem trustworthy actually is. I mean, that does seem to flow. I don't know how well he ever articulated that, but it seems like this gigantic issue for him.
Well, it's a very large issue. And I think what it has to do with is that what I say in the book is that fear, the thing that he's against his entire life, and all his movies are against, are complacency. He knows that evil can happen because we get too relaxed, we get too comfortable, and as you say, we get too trusting maybe, and we don't see that evil might be among us, and terrible things happen because we are not alert. And he wants us to be alert. That's part of what suspense is, and that's part of what being afraid is for him, is to be very alert and to not be complacent. It runs all through his films.
So, Tom, as a person considerably younger than me, and as somebody who has devoted quite a bit of his time and life to film, I'm sort of wondering, I mean, you must have had to kind of almost inhale a lot of Hitchcock all at once. I mean, we talk about binge watching, but, in order to be serious about this, you probably had to ingest an awful lot of Hitchcock. I'm just sort of wondering, from the perspective of somebody who's much more a person of this century as opposed to the last one, how do you process Hitchcock? Who is he to you?
Well, yeah, I would say that's very much true. My first job ever in high school was at a movie store, kind of right as all of the VHS were being dropped and DVDs were coming in. And I certainly remember a lot of people renting Psycho and North by Northwest. So even before I kind of fell down the film criticism rabbit hole, I'm certainly very aware of Alfred Hitchcock as a kind of titan of this art form. And is there any better director to inhale their work, especially that stuff in the 1950s, from Rear Window to Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho and the Birds in the early 60s. I mean, this is all, he is a kind of master of straddling that entertainment and art divide. Each work is such a joy, it's such a thrill to watch. And yet he also, I think, as Dan was saying, as you were saying, because of his incredible sensitivity to interests of fear and of trust, of a really kind of uncertain sense of individual identity, these very modern obsessions that he had, it is very easy just to become, completely wrapped up in his work. The level of kind of audience identification with even the most manic and maniacal of characters is so easy in Hitchcock films, not because they're plausible in a realistic sense, but because he knows, and his actors and actresses know, how to get the audience believing every single bit of it, how to fall into that world. And so as a younger person, slightly younger person, inhaling all of this stuff at once, it is, it almost seems like it's meant to be watched that way all at once, because he is he's an auteur. I should say, one of my, what really got me into movies in the first place, besides working in a movie store, was film criticism. And one of the kind of epochal books for me was Francois Truffaut's interviews with Hitchcock in the early 1960s, published a little bit later. And to have someone, a film geek of that era like Truffaut, so immersed in every single image, every single movie that this guy made, it kind of opened my eyes to how to approach a filmmaker's work, not just one by one, but as a whole. And Hitchcock's a great person to do that with.
Dan, well, one reason that I called Tom a person of this century is that Hitchcock is so emphatically giving us this kind of Cook's tour of the 20th century. I mean, and all of his issues about fear and distrust are easily superimposed on the moment. Are you a German spy? Are you a saboteur? Are you a communist spy? Are you,
I think that the thing is that he knows that evil can be seductive. He knows that evil can be attractive. He knows that a Nazi or a spy might be very charming, very appealing. And he also knows that the good person, the good people, they might not have too much charm. They might not be too appealing. And so these are surface things that can screw us up. And he's very attuned to that. That's part of his whole thing of what we look like, what we seem like, and what we actually are. And that's what's so disturbing about the films and so profound about them.
So, Dan, one of the things that I think you stress in the book is, for those reasons, he was interested and attracted to actors who could kind of live in an in-between space, who could, in fact, be kind of dry erase boards of uncertainty and ambivalence, right? The really kind of the Betty Davis type performer maybe isn't the right performer for him because that actor is making such a strong signature.
Yes, he, as I say in the book, I think that Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman are the ultimate Hitchcock actors because they are always straddling a line between this and that. They're on the fence. They aren't definite about anything. It's always in flux. There's an edginess about them. Whereas if you are a Betty Davis, if you are a Brando, if you are a Meryl Streep, it's all going to be very clear and very definite. And he can't use actors like that. He can use actors who, ideally, they look like one thing, but actually there's something else underneath. Like Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train. He had played these kind of aw shucks, soldier ingenue types in the 1940s. And then in Strangers on a Train, he still seems like that, charming, aw shucks, but he's actually a cold-blooded killer. And he's very interested in that switch.
All right, so we're going to get back to Robert Walker in just a second, but you spoke of Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, which means we have to, by law, play a clip from Notorious. Here we go.
Anything else?
Nothing important. Just a minor item, but you may want it for the record.
What is it?
You can add Sebastian's name to my list of playmates.
pretty fast work.
That's what you wanted, wasn't it?
Skip it.
Alex says they've been holding him back all season.
Can't help recalling some of your remarks about being a new woman. Daisies and buttercups, wasn't it?
You idiot. What are you sore about? You knew very well what I was doing.
Did I?
You could have stopped me with one word, but no, you couldn't. You threw me at him.
I threw you at nobody.
Didn't you tell me to go ahead?
A man doesn't tell a woman what to do, she tells herself. You almost had me believing in that little hokey-pokey miracle of yours, that a woman like you could ever change her spots.
Oh, you're rotten.
That's why I didn't try to stop you. The answer had to come from you.
I see. Some kind of love test.
That's right.
Well, you never believed in me anyway, so what's the difference?
Lucky for both of us, I didn't. It wouldn't have been pretty if I believed in you. If I'd figured she'd never be able to go through with it, she'd been made over by love.
It's interesting because a few years later, he's having the same conversation with Eva Marie Saint, more or less. But I want to talk a little bit about sex and sexuality at this point. Tom, in a way, Hitchcock is introducing people or is showing people a world of available sex in a way that, particularly in certain periods, might not have been quite as crystal clear as it has been maybe more lately. I'm thinking, that clip is an example, but even the 39 Steps, which came out in 1935, it begins pretty much with this woman saying to this Canadian guy after this weird incident in a nightclub, "Can I go back to your place?" I mean, those are the first words she utters to him, and he kind of, in this very Canadian way, goes, "Oh, okay, take your chances," or whatever. So it's weird because you see this idea of maybe reality being saturated by sexual opportunity, but I think, Tom, as you observed, you also feel this tremendous amount of repression.
Yeah, sex I think looms large in Hitchcock's work, to say the least. And to maybe answer this question and also pick up on what you and Dan were just talking about, I mean, I really think that the insight that Dan has in his book about Hitchcock's penchant for, quote unquote, negative acting, or for actors who could be on screen and do nothing as opposed to do a lot, is a really fascinating one. I mean, these are big stars of the art, right? Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Ingrid Bergman, Kim Novak. I mean, these are really familiar faces. And I think the way that Alfred Hitchcock knew how to, make those faces fill the entirety of the screen, make their hands fill the entirety of the screen, really kind of present this individual in their kind of, their most expressive kind of entirety to the audience, but then also have that actor do as little as possible to let the audience kind of fill in the blanks, again, is so such a masterful technique for encouraging audience identification. And what more, would an audience want to identify with than these incredibly, attractive people engaged in all of these like really sexually loaded, conversations and occasionally kind of physical interactions. I think that, maybe this could be a good time to talk about Vertigo a little bit. One of the probably most celebrated work. It's 2012 in the Sight and Sound Pulse. But
actually, Jonathan McPants doesn't want us to talk about Vertigo. Yeah.
Oh, not Vertigo yet. Okay.
He has a plan.
But I do think that not just in the superficial similarities of all of the young, busty, blonde women that Hitchcock cast in his movies, which I think speaks volumes to what we should talk about later about maybe the sexism that also looms large over this work. I think that Hitchcock really felt like at a time when Freudian theories of the edible complex and stuff like that were just a really big deal in trying to understand everything about society, everything about art. I think Hitchcock zeroed in on the fraught sexual and sexually repressed relationships we had with lovers, with friends, with family members as maybe the most important motivating influence for every part of life, and combine that with the kind of dreamlike logic that so many of Hitchcock's movies operate by. It is a really, it's at times it feels kind of scandalizing and violating, obviously Psycho being a good example of feeling violated by what's going on screen, but also he's identified this as a really important part of human existence that he wants to explore again and again and again and again.
So, so I think it was interesting, some of the things that Tom just mentioned, Dan, and I'll zero in on one of them here, which is, if you think about Rear Window, there is a quintessentially busty blonde who the Jimmy Stewart character refers to as Miss Torso over there. But In fact, the apex of desirability is Grace Kelly, who's a very, very different creature. And this is, I think, something that you explore a lot in your book is, who are women to Hitchcock, and what does he crave in them? What does he want us to crave in them? It's something more, really, I think, than just somebody who's blonde and stacked.
There's different types of women. There's the Grace Kelly, there's the blonde, but then there's also the Barbara Bel Geddes in Vertigo. And his own daughter, Patricia Hitchcock, who's in several of his movies, including Psycho and Strangers on a Train. There's the woman who is very blunt and funny and is not at all the goddess. There's the goddess, and so what he had in life with his wife and with his daughter, it was this very blunt, sort of not fantasy, not sexuality, not just no mystery at all, And so he's always weighing these two things in his films between the goddess who he longs for and then the reality of life, which is, and he puts them both into his films, and he's always weighing the two of them. I mean, it's a very complicated subject.
It is a very complicated subject. I guess maybe this is a good point to mention that according to Hitchcock, and Dan, I don't know what you make of this statement, but he said either jokingly or seriously that he'd only had sexual intercourse once for the purpose of creating progeny. Does that strike you as a truth or kind of a quasi-truth and something that has the quality of being true?
I think it's probably pretty close to the truth. Mm-hmm. If it isn't the absolute, I think it's probably pretty close to the truth. And so someone who isn't having sex at all, of course, they're obsessed with sex as a subject, and imagine the torment of that too, so that is something that if you want to understand where the films come from, where the art comes from, that is the basis of it. But we wouldn't still be interested in Hitchcock if he wasn't someone who gets way beyond that in his films. I think what I was speaking about with Tom earlier was that he's curious about every person in his films. He's curious about everyone, and he identifies with all of them, even the small part players. And his films are so great because you can wonder about the people who play bit parts practically, who have 4 or 5 lines. They are whole human beings, 3-dimensional human beings, mysterious, and you want to know more about them. And I mean, that's part of the richness of his films and why it's so much fun to watch his films more than once. You can watch them over and over again, and you always are going to see something new. You always are going to perceive something else in them because they're jam-packed with all these rich characters.
Right.
If I may interject
yeah.
very quickly on that before we leave the kind of sex and sexual repression and also all the side characters, I think Rear Window is a perfect example of what you and Dan were just talking about. And one, the main character played by Jimmy Stewart, immobilized and effectively impotent, it seems to be greatly motivated by his inability to do anything, including having sex, and that seems to be driving this voyeuristic impulse to look at what everyone across the way is doing in their own private apartments. But as Dan was saying, I mean, talk about a movie with great characters that just kind of appear and then they're gone. Miss Lonely Hearts. I don't remember the name of the actress, but Dan has a few wonderful facts about
Judith Evelyn.
Oh my goodness, she's just lovely. But I mean, the investment that Hitchcock and the audience have in her story, a woman who I'm not even sure if her character has a name beyond Miss Lonely Hearts, in her desperation, her loneliness, the camaraderie between her and Jimmy Stewart's character just by virtue of him watching her. I mean, the empathy that develops. It's really an incredible relationship without anyone meeting once in the movie. It's just incredible.
Yes.
Yeah, what's great about it is, if you remember in Rear Window when Jimmy Stewart is looking at Miss Lonely Hearts when she's doing that really pitiful dinner and pretending like she's with someone, and he toasts her. It's wonderful because he feels like he identifies with her. Like he knows like the Miss Lonely Hearts in him. He's toasting it, and that's so beautiful. That's why I think Rear Window is my favorite Hitchcock movie, because it's the most hopeful of them. Whereas a few of the others are pretty despairing. Rear Window isn't.
Yeah, there was a fascinating staging of Rear Window by the Hartford Stage Company a few years ago, and it kind of with everything that was done with the set, Tom, calls to mind one of your thoughts about Hitchcock, Tom, and that is that he's a very interpretable director. He invites, I mean, you could look at Rear Window 5 or 6 different ways. And you could do that. I mean, sometimes what you're seeing is very obvious. Train goes into a tunnel. We get it. But there are, I think you suggest a lot of invitations to interpret.
And of course, I mean, that is another key part of my love for Hitchcock. I think a lot of people's love for Hitchcock. I mean, I can't think of a director who puts actual kind of psychiatrists in his movies as frequently as Hitchcock does, of course, in Psycho and in Vertigo. And there's a wonderful scene, towards the end of The Birds, where the whole family is kind of trapped in their cottage as it's being bombarded by birds attacking them. And all they really do is just shout, "Why is this happening?" at one another. This need to try to understand what is happening without any actual single answer being offered. We can talk about how that works in Psycho a little bit too. But I think that Hitchcock is very aware that you want to keep things simple. You want to make sure that the audience understand what's going on, that they are kind of cued into the crop duster flying in the background, that something serious, weighty is about to happen. But also, you can't provide every single answer. These aren't movies just about things. These movies are things. These are, discrete works of art that offer, let the audience understand, try to come up with their own understanding as to what on earth is going on in here. Why on earth is Scotty Ferguson, undressing and dressing and undressing and dressing this apparent complete stranger? What is it that's motivating them? I think the beauty of Hitchcock movies is that he doesn't want the audience to think that the answer is any one thing, or at least I don't think he does. And that interpretability is just a joy.
All right, we're going to have to take a little break here. We'll go out with some music from Rear Window. I have to, this is for 10 years been my favorite piece of movie trivia, that the piano playing guy in Rear Window is the Alvin and the Chipmunks guy. So I will take this opportunity to say that. But anyway, here's some music from Rear Window. We'll be back with more Hitchcock.
Now, let's say that you'd like to get rid of your wife.
It's a morbid thought.
No. Just suppose. Let's say that you had a very good reason.
No, let's not.
Let's say. Now, you'd be afraid to kill her. You know why? You'd get caught. And what would trip you up? The motive. Now, here's my idea.
I'm afraid I haven't got time to listen, Bruce.
Listen, it's so simple, too. Two fellows meet accidentally, like you and me. No connection between them at all. Never saw each other before. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of. So, they swap murders.
Swap murders?
Each fellow does the other fellow's murder. Then there's nothing to connect them. Each one has murdered a total stranger. Like, you do my murder, I do yours.
We're coming into my station.
For example, your wife, my father. Crisscross.
All right, so you're hearing Farley Granger and Robert Walker in Strangers from a Train. So many trains. Strangers on a Train. So many trains in Hitchcock. So, Dan, you write at length about the performance of Robert Walker, which was alluded to in the preceding segment too, that it might be the best performance in all of Hitchcock. Say more about that.
Well, I think Robert Walker was in a very bad place when he was shooting Strangers on a Train. He'd broken up with his wife, Jennifer Jones. He had been he'd been institutionalized, really.
At the Menninger Clinic.
Yes. And so he came out, and he had never played a part like this before. And Hitchcock was very aware that he was dealing with a very volatile situation. And he even said to Farley Granger, something might happen on our film. We don't know. He was interested to see if he put this in front of the camera, what would happen. And so to me, I mean, we heard just a little, you've heard his voice and everything. There's something about Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train where it's kind of this uncapped essence of disturbance and danger and this ambiguity. And it's something that you can't even put your finger on what it is because it's so pure, you know? And so really, I think that that's why I say that Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train is maybe the ultimate in what Hitchcock wanted from an actor, because it was so non-definite and it was so unsettling.
We should say Tom was talking about psychiatrists in Hitchcock movies. Robert Walker was sort of, at least according to one theory, kind of accidentally killed by his psychiatrist. He was having some kind of episode, and his psychiatrist was summoned and gave him some kind of injection that interacted with whatever else he had in his system. At least so goes one theory of Robert Walker's death, which was not too long after Strangers on a Train, too. Yeah. But, Tom, this goes back, what Dan is saying now, goes back to what you were saying before. I just have to quickly recall that I went to see the movie Speed with my friend Lou Wise. And when we walked out, Lou said, "You know what I liked about the movie Speed?" He said, "I always knew what was happening. I was never in any doubt." And Tom, as you and Dan have both alluded to, that's the antithesis of Hitchcock. The entire time in most movies, you don't know what's happening. You don't know who to trust. You don't know which story is true. And it's kind of amazing that people will put up with that. I think human beings normally crave a certain amount of certainty. They like to know what's going on. I don't know, Tom, do you have a theory about like how Hitchcock can get away with this?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating and important insight. And I think that, as we've been saying throughout, Hitchcock kind of has it both ways. He really, I think is evidenced by his conversations with Francois Truffaut and everything we've said today. He's not a big fan of the plausibilists, people who would say, well, that wouldn't really happen that way. There's no way a stranger, who just kind of bumps shoes with someone on a train would wind up killing their wife at a carnival fairground or something. But I think that what Hitchcock's narratives, the lack of kind of certainty and surety they offer the audience, I think formally he is so adept at presenting as clear an image as possible. Again, I think the quintessential example is the crop duster sequence that I alluded to earlier in North by Northwest. This is the height of gratuity. There's no need for this scene to exist in the movie at all. I mean, Cary Grant playing this ad man on the run in this kind of spy adventure. For some reason, he's kind of sent out to the middle of nowhere, this really middle of farmland, and in this beautiful and almost entirely silent sequence, we see at first that there is a plane kind of zooming around in the background. We don't know that this is going to become the most pivotal part of the climax of this scene, but the way that Hitchcock introduces it visually, orally, the way that we hear what's going on, the way that everyone kind of stops talking, this is what makes film so different than literature or a type of art that's entirely reliant upon what people say and the words that one is reading. Hitchcock knows how to use all of the different elements that make film this kind of composite form of art to make sure that, I think, in his best movies, the audience does know what's going on, even if narratively it doesn't really matter. I mean, this is the MacGuffin guy, right? Like, you don't have to really know what the spy secrets are, but you have to know that they're important to the characters, and you have to know that something's building to a perhaps apocalyptic height.
Okay, so Dan, there's a lot to pull apart in what Tom says, but I should say, by the way, we're talking to Tom Breen, managing editor of the New Haven Independent, hosted a deep focus on WNHH Radio, and Dan Callahan, who writes about film. His newest book is The Camera Lies, Acting for Hitchcock. So, there's kind of an interesting dynamic tension or paradox in some of the things in the book, Dan, particularly the idea that on the one hand, you have Hitchcock as this, I don't know, he's pretty godlike as a director. It's kind of like, look, you don't have to do too much. My camera will find you, frame you, get you to do a good performance. But on the other hand, he likes to work with iconic stars. You say that one reason he likes to work with iconic stars is he believes that people care more about what happens to Cary Grant out there in that field with that crop duster. They're going to be much more worried about Cary Grant than they would be about somebody they've never seen before in their lives. But it just is interesting how many iconic actors, who really represent the creme de la creme, decade after decade, he wants to have in his movies, even though he clearly also thinks that he should be in charge of pretty much everything. So I don't know. Can you tease out that paradox a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think the important thing about him and actors, he was born in England, and in his 1930s movies in England, he was working with very distinguished theater actors like John Gielgud, Peggy Ashcroft, Michael Redgrave. And the thing that he didn't like about them was that they didn't take his little thrillers seriously. They were doing Chekhov and Shakespeare in the evening, and they didn't care about this little thriller that they were doing. And he could feel that, and he didn't like that. And that's why he said his famous line, actors are cattle, and because he was offended that they didn't take what he was doing seriously. But when he went to America, and as the years went on, when he did Psycho, Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins were both very serious about their parts. And he was very happy about that. And so he was very happy to let Anthony Perkins add lines and add bits of business. And when Janet Leigh is doing the scene in the car where she's driving and hearing thoughts in her head, he sat by the camera and read them to her because he wanted to, give her the mood that she needed. And so I think this thing of him not wanting to work with actors, it's that he didn't want to work with actors who didn't take what he was doing seriously. If they took it seriously, he was happy and touched to work with them.
Right. Although paradoxically, another paradox, he told the woman who played Miss Torso to go to Europe and do Chekhov, and then when she came back, he would make her a star. She didn't do any of that stuff, but he obviously had some kind of belief, that the trained actors, he had some kind of faith in that process. But as you're saying, he just didn't want Gielgud coming from his Shakespeare productions and looking down his nose at whatever movie Hitchcock was shooting at the time. I want to talk a little bit about Vertigo. Some people say Vertigo. I mean, it is sometimes clocks in at number 1 on the list of the greatest movies ever made, which is a pointless exercise anyway, but there you have it. Maybe we should begin by playing this scene that takes place between, I'm actually on the wrong page here. The scene that takes place between Jimmy Stewart and Barbara Bel Geddes. Kat, do you see where that is? Okay. Go ahead.
I wake up at night seeing that man fall from the roof, and I try to reach out to him, and it's just...
It wasn't your fault.
I know, that's what everybody tells me.
Johnny, the doctors explained to you.
I know. I have acrophobia, which gives me vertigo, and I get dizzy. Boy, what a moment to find out I had it.
Well, you got it, and there's no losing it. And there's no one to blame. So why quit?
You mean to sit behind a desk, chairborne?
Where you belong.
What about my acrophobia? Now, suppose I'm sitting in this chair behind the desk. Here's the desk. And a pencil falls from the desk down to the floor. And I reach down to pick up the pencil. Bingo, my acrophobia is back.
Oh, Johnny-o.
So, one thing that you said before, Dan, is that Hitchcock's interested in all of the lives of all of his characters. And he's very interested in Midge here and struggled a little bit with Barbara Bel Geddes about how to play these scenes. Tell us what he wound up saying to her.
Well, Barbara Bel Geddes was studying at the Actors Studio, and she wanted motivation. She wanted, like we were talking before about how Hitchcock doesn't want to tell you everything. Method actors of the 50s he had trouble with, like Barbara Bel Geddes, because they wanted everything explained to them. And so what he said to her was, now, Barbara, don't act. He didn't want her to act. If you remember that scene at the beginning when Scotty is talking to Midge about how they once were engaged, all she does is she looks down and she looks up. And he doesn't want Barbara Bel Geddes to be signaling to us, oh, I wish we'd gotten married, or, oh, I'm glad we didn't get married. No, he wants a completely blank slate so that we can project what we think might have occurred between them. And that worked very well because there have been whole books written about Vertigo. There have been whole books written about the look on her face practically, so that's the Hitchcock method.
Right. It's sort of...
So it goes against what she wanted and what Montgomery Clift and a lot of the method actors of that time wanted.
Right. It's sort of like, just do a couple of little things and I'll come find you. I'll come find you with my camera. I'll frame you. I'll make you who you really need to be. He also apparently had some problems with Martin Landau in North by Northwest for similar reasons, that whole method thing. Although, Tom, another paradox here, which is, you could argue that Kim Novak's performance in Vertigo is one of the most elaborate pieces of kind of attention-getting acting. It's hard to walk away from Vertigo and say, wow, those transformations, that was really amazing. I mean, in a way, that's a real actor's movie.
And a few things. First, let me say that I love Barbara Bel Geddes in Vertigo as well. And probably my favorite, one of my favorite moments of Vertigo and one of the more emotionally affecting is when, one of the few moments where Bel Geddes does get to emote a bit more evocatively after she kind of makes a mistake, shows this portrait that she thought would be amusing to Scotty Ferguson, and he walks out and he's really hurt. And then, there's just a few seconds where she groans, she kind of pulls her hair, and there's just a small burst of, just complete frustration with herself that I just find devastating, considering how much she's tried not to act beforehand. I think Kim Novak is probably my favorite. This performance as Judy Barton, as Madeline Elster, is probably my favorite performance in any Hitchcock movie. And Dan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Hitchcock also struggled quite a bit working with Kim Novak, who I think he said asked too many questions on set or something like that.
And he said a really fascinating thing to her, which she's repeated. She was doing too much, he thought, in the scenes. And he said to her, what you're doing is, it's like your face is a blank sheet of paper and you're scribbling all over the paper so we can't read it. I want you to write one clear sentence on the sheet of paper, and then it will work. And then it will, because she wanted too much explained to her, like Barbara Bel Geddes. And so she did that. She simplified, and it's the thing that's fascinating is that even though if we've seen the movie a lot of times, in the first half, when Judy Barton is pretending to be Madeline, pretending to be the blonde, if you try to look for Judy Barton playing the part of Madeline in that first half of the movie, you almost can never catch her. You almost never catch, maybe one time, one little look here and there, you can maybe see that this is a person playing a role. But what's fascinating from an acting perspective and from a human perspective is that, in a way, Judy Barton finds the Madeline part of herself, and maybe she likes that part of herself better than her actual self. And certainly Kim Novak could understand that. See, actors act a lot of the time because they want to play someone better than themselves, more articulate, more appealing, and that's what's sad about acting, but that's also what's hopeful about it.
And I think that, just very briefly on why I so love this performance. And I think it's, it's a real, just perfect, synchronicity or of character and of actress and performance and of director. I mean, the way that we see Kim Novak merge the characters of Judy Barton and Madeline, especially in the latter half, shows so much about Hitchcock's obsession with people who dissemble, people who try to present, one thing to one person and another to another, but also ultimately the futility of it all. All of these different urges, this kind of animal quality, that this feral quality that Kim Novak brings to Judy Barton, and also the ethereal quality she brings to Madeline Elster, they exist within the same person. And I think the genius of Hitchcock is that he's able to bring that out in her, in the genius of Novak. She can bring it too.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here. We're talking about Alfred Hitchcock and his actors, and we'll do more of that on the other side of this.
Is your time so empty?
No. Well, I run the office and tend the cabins and grounds and do little errands for my mother. The ones she allows I might be capable of doing.
Do you go out with friends?
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother. You've never had an empty moment in your entire life, have you?
Only my share.
Where are you going? I didn't mean to pry.
I'm looking for a private island.
What are you running away from?
Why do you ask that?
No. People never run away from anything.
All right, just hold your thoughts about that clip, both the guests and audience. And let me say that our guests today are Tom Breen, managing editor of the New Haven Independent, and a wonderful writer about film, and Dan Callahan, also a wonderful writer about film. His newest book is The Camera Lies, Acting for Hitchcock. And I have to thank some people, starting with Kat Pastor is the technical producer of this show. She's in the studio. I am elsewhere. So is Jonathan McPants, who is the producer of this episode and many others. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening to this show. We have one segment left to go. And so, Dan, there are a lot of ways to kind of chop up the timeline of Hitchcock's movies, of his total oeuvre. But one way you can do it is, and this is all courtesy of Jonathan McPants, but you can say that in 6 years, he made 4 completely indispensable movies: Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho. So 1954 to 1960, he makes those 4 movies. But there's some people who might say that Psycho is kind of a little bit different, a little bit more of a departure, a little bit more of an actual horror movie, as is The Birds, than everything that had gone before. So much of what has gone before are these kind of elegant, interesting people in beautiful locales, people who look like Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint. This is a really different kind of movie in some ways. Or, Dan, would you argue, no, it's a logical extension of everything he's been doing?
No, I think it is very different. And I think the milieu is different. And these are people who don't have money. They lead a black and white life, which is why they're in a black and white movie, and part of her problem at the beginning of the movie is she's in this dead end job. She doesn't have any money. Norman is stuck in this hotel and no one's ever coming to it. And so, but there's a quality of a nightmare there. And Hitchcock was very interested in getting the details right. He sent his production people to Phoenix, Arizona to take photos of lobbies and hotel rooms because he wanted to get atmosphere into it. And I think if you remember Psycho, if you've looked at Psycho, there is a feeling of the Southwest, the glaring sun, and it is very different from these color films with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, where there is an escapism element. There's no escaping in Psycho. Psycho is this very, very different kind of thing, very much so. So I think things have gotten darker, things have darkened. Though even in the 40s, they're pretty dark. Notorious is pretty dark. Lifeboat is pretty dark. I should mention, Hitchcock was in charge of editing this footage of concentration camps at the end of World War II. And so he was looking at this incredibly just horrible footage, the worst footage possible. And what he said is to his technicians, he said to them, I don't want you to do anything with the footage. I want it to be very simple because we don't want people to think we've edited it and made it into something Hitchcockian, like cutting and montage and all that. He just wanted it to be very, very, very simple so that people could just look at it, Mm-hmm. So I think that's something to keep in mind about Hitchcock, is that he's very aware of the very worst of human beings, and that's partly where the real darkness in the work starts to come out.
All right. Even though I'm dying to have Tom do his take on the end of Psycho, I'm not going to do it because we're running out of time here, and we really have to just explore the question about whether Hitchcock himself is the very worst of human beings and the darkest of human beings. Tom shares a life with somebody who would be really angry at us, so we can at least attempt to deal with this somehow. So, Tom, we know more and more, and as is pointed out in Dan's book, more and more is claimed, too. It's kind of not necessarily clear what the exact truth is. But at some point, Hitchcock's just fairly benign and passive interest in beautiful women turns into something darker and more aggressive and more exploitive. And so what do we do with that now? I mean, we live in an era of cancel culture, but how could you even cancel Hitchcock?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm probably going to for some of the more kind of biographical details and allegations, so I'll defer to Dan, who knows more about that. But of course, Tippi Hedren, the star of the Birds, has said frequently that Hitchcock really harassed her and was really a terror to work with, and potentially kind of really sexually was abusive, harassing, whatever the best words to describe that. I also want to return, I was looking through, different write-ups of Hitchcock for the show, and I came across the film critic David Thompson in his kind of biographical dictionary of film is pretty dismissive of Hitchcock, and he calls him, quote, an impoverished inventor of thumbscrews who show us the human capacity for inflicting pain. And I think that at its worst, I think that is kind of what Hitchcock does, especially to women. I mean, we see this incredible diversity of character, of intellect, of ambition in Hitchcock's women, including Marion Crane, including Judy Barton. And in some of, I think, the movie's most weighed down by this domineering male impulse to control women. I watched Vertigo with Lucy, and she really hated how much, there's just this luxuriating in a man completely destroying the life of a woman, molding her to his very touch. I think that there is something very, critical in Hitchcock's movie of that attitude of men towards women, and yet it's undeniably a source of a kind of perverse pleasure that Hitchcock gets. So whether that is related to his off-screen kind of alleged assaults, I think that on screen we see plenty to feel really queasy about in the way that women, not just the way they look, the way they're treated.
All right, Dan, we have a little bit less than 3 minutes left, and this is like a 40-minute conversation, but you can have all 3 minus of those minutes.
Well, I mean, I think that what we have to understand is that Hitchcock as a human being and Hitchcock as an artist really are two different things, because his art is better than he was as a human being. I think as a human being, he was a very unhappy man, and towards the end of his life, he behaved very badly, and he behaved very badly with Tippi Hedren. The thing is, in The Birds and in Marnie, Tippi Hedren is very touching in Marnie, and the movie is very touching. And terrible things were going on between the two of them while they were shooting it. And that's one thing. The result on the screen is another thing. And Hitchcock would not be worth talking about if he wasn't a great artist. And he's a great artist because he identifies with all of the people in his movies, and that means that he identifies with the women. He often identifies with the women far more than he identifies with the men. The men in his movies are often quite unsympathetic, and the women are often extremely sympathetic. I think what he said to Francois Truffaut is that he said that he was uncomfortable sometimes shooting a scene like the shower scene, because on the one hand, he knew he was doing it as a kind of technical feat. But on the other hand, he said to him, so I often will think about what it would be like for the victim. I'm always thinking about what it would be like. It is worth, this thing of the person and the art that they make. Hitchcock as a person, he was very unhappy. He wanted to be Cary Grant, and he wasn't. And Cary Grant himself wasn't Cary Grant. But that's part of what these very rich and troubling and complicated movies are all about. And that's partly why there have been so many books, there have been so many reactions to them, because if you're making a bad film, you're going to say, this is what my movie is about. I am going to make this movie about this, that, or the other thing. Hitchcock never does that, because a real artist, a great artist, is someone who operates by instinct. And,
right.
And they get at things, dreamlike things that are important to say about evil and good and being complacent. I
got to stop you right there. We're like literally out of time. Dan Callahan, the book is The Camera Lies, Acting for Hitchcock. Tom Breen is, of course, managing editor of the New Haven Independent and much more besides. I really hate this song, and I was cheered up to discover Doris Day, who I really love, hated this song too.
What will be, will be. Que sera.